The fluorescent lights hummed their familiar tune across the marble floors of First National Trust when branch manager Margaret Chen arrived that Thursday morning at 6:47 a.m. She clutched her coffee like a lifeline, the steam curling up into the artificial dawn of the banking floor. The security guard Rodriguez nodded from behind his desk, his eyes already heavy from the night shift that would end in 13 minutes. Before we dive in, don't forget to like, subscribe, and comment below. Margaret's heels clicked against the polished stone as she made her way toward the elevator bank. The morning ritual never changed. Check overnight reports, review pending transfers, prepare for the 9 a.m. staff meeting. But today, something would shatter that routine forever. The call came at 8:23 a.m. Treasury Operations Manager David Kleinfeld's voice carried an edge of panic that Margaret had never heard in their 12 years of working together. "Margaret, we have a problem. A big problem." She pressed the phone closer to her ear, watching through her office window as tellers began arriving for their shifts. "What kind of problem, David?" "The overnight transfer to Federal Reserve didn't go through. System shows insufficient funds in Vault C7. Margaret's coffee grew cold as the words sank in. Vault C7 housed the bank's largest cash reserves, a subterranean fortress 3 stories below street level. The automated counting systems check those funds every 6 hours. There should have been $47.8 million in various denominations, carefully tracked and monitored by redundant security systems. "Run the count again," Margaret said, though something in her stomach already knew what they would find. 23 minutes later, David's voice cracked through the intercom. "Margaret, you need to get down here. Now." The elevator descended past the main banking floor, past the safety deposit box level, past the employee break rooms, down into the vault complex that most customers never knew existed. The air grew colder with each floor, the hum of machinery replacing the gentle murmur of commerce above. Vault C7's massive door stood open, revealing rows of metal shelving that should have held neat stacks of bundled currency. Margaret's eyes swept across the organized chaos of remaining bills. Tens of thousands of dollars still sat in their designated spots, untouched. But where the $100 bills had been stored, where the largest concentrations of wealth had rested just hours before, empty spaces stared back like missing teeth. "How much?" Margaret asked, though her voice barely rose above a whisper. David consulted his tablet, his fingers trembling slightly as he scrolled through the inventory data. $10.2 million. Gone. The silence that followed seemed to press against the vault walls. No alarms had sounded. No emergency protocols had triggered. The security system showed no signs of breach, no indication that anything extraordinary had occurred in the depths of First National Trust. Margaret walked deeper into the vault, her heels now muffled against industrial carpet. The remaining money sat in perfect order, as if whoever had taken the missing bills had done so with surgical precision. No scattered currency, no signs of haste. The theft had been executed with the methodical care of someone who understood exactly how the bank operated. "Pull the security footage," she said. "All of it. From 6 p.m. yesterday through 6 a.m. this morning." As David hurried away to coordinate with the security department, Margaret stood alone among the remaining millions, trying to comprehend how someone had walked into the most secure part of the building and walked out with enough money to buy a small office building, all without triggering a single sensor. The investigation would soon reveal that this was not the work of a master criminal or an elaborate heist crew. This was something far more unsettling. The perfect crime committed by someone who had been invisible for so long that the bank's own security system had learned to ignore him entirely. Leonard "Lenny" Cruz had been cleaning the executive floors of First National Trust for exactly 14 years, 2 months, and 16 days when he found the piece of paper that would change his life forever. To most people in the building, he was as permanent and unremarkable as the fire extinguishers or the emergency exit signs. Necessary, functional, and completely forgettable. At 58, Lenny moved through the bank's corridors with the quiet efficiency of someone who had mapped every inch of the building in his mind. He knew which conference rooms the executives preferred for sensitive meetings. He knew that the third-floor bathroom's motion sensor had a dead zone near the far stall. He knew that the vault level's air circulation system created a faint whistling sound at 2:17 a.m. every night, like clockwork. What most people didn't know about Lenny was that he had once been an electrical engineer, before the factory closures, before the divorce that took half his savings, before the long slide into the kind of work that kept you invisible but kept you employed. He had graduated from Newark College of Engineering in 1987 with a degree that had once meant something. He had worked for Westinghouse for 11 years, designing control systems for industrial facilities. He understood electronics, security protocols, and the kind of redundant safety systems that banks relied on to protect their assets. But that was another life. This was the life where he arrived at First National Trust every weekday at 11 p.m., badged in through the service entrance, and spent the next 7 hours cleaning up after people who made more in a week than he made in a year. The cleaning crew consisted of 4 people: Maria, who handled the first 2 floors, Carlos, who took care of the customer areas, Janet, who managed the teller stations and ATM areas, and Lenny, who cleaned the executive level in the secure zones. That required special clearance. His supervisor, a harried contractor named Eddie Kowalski, had given Lenny the vault-level assignment because of his reliability. In 14 years, Lenny had never missed a shift, never been caught lingering where he shouldn't, never asked questions about what he saw or heard during his nightly rounds. "Lenny's like a ghost," Eddie would tell new hires. "You'll never know he was there except everything's clean in the morning." It was meant as a compliment, but it was more accurate than Eddie realized. Lenny had perfected the art of invisibility. Security guards would nod at him without really seeing him. Executives working late would continue their phone conversations as he emptied their wastebaskets, as if he were simply another piece of office equipment. This invisibility had given Lenny an education in banking that few people outside the industry ever received. He had overheard merger discussions, listened to loan committee deliberations, and observed the daily rituals of moving money that kept the institution functioning. He knew, for instance, that the vault-level security cameras operated on a rotation cycle that left brief blind spots during system updates. He knew that the overnight security staff consisted of 1 guard who spent most of his time monitoring the upper floors where break-ins were more likely. He knew that the vault access logs were reviewed only during quarterly audits, unless something went wrong. Most importantly, he had developed an almost supernatural ability to move through the building without attracting attention. His key card gave him access to areas that most employees never saw, and his presence in those areas had become so routine that the security system had essentially learned to ignore him. The irony was not lost on him that his engineering background had prepared him to understand exactly how vulnerable the bank's security really was, while his invisible status as a janitor had given him the access to exploit those vulnerabilities. But for 14 years, Lenny had been content to remain invisible, to do his job, and to collect his modest paycheck. He had no criminal history, no gambling debts, no desperate circumstances that might drive someone to theft. What he had was time, hours each night to observe, to think, to understand the intricate systems that protected hundreds of millions of dollars just a few floors beneath his feet. And what he was about to discover was that sometimes the most sophisticated security systems could be undone by a single moment of human carelessness. On the night of March 15, as Lenny made his usual rounds through the executive floor, he found that moment crumpled under a filing cabinet in conference room 7B, where the bank's IT security team had been working on a vault system upgrade. The crumpled sheet of paper might have been mistaken for trash by anyone else. It was standard office stock, slightly yellowed, with coffee ring stains along one edge. But to someone with Leonard Cruz's background in electrical engineering and security systems, it was immediately recognizable as something much more valuable. The header read, "Temporary Bypass Codes, Vault Access System 3.7, Firmware Update March 15th. Below that, a series of alphanumeric sequences that looked like password gibberish to most people, but represented something far more significant to someone who understood how security systems worked. Lenny had been cleaning conference room 7B at 2:34 a.m. when he found the paper wedged under the heavy oak filing cabinet near the window. The IT security team had finished their work around midnight, leaving behind the usual detritus of a technical project: empty pizza boxes, energy drink cans, and apparently one very important piece of documentation that had either been dropped or forgotten in their haste to complete the upgrade. He might have thrown it away, should have thrown it away. That was his job: remove the trash, wipe down the surfaces, vacuum the carpet, and move on to the next room. But something about the technical language caught his attention. awakening the engineer who had been dormant for so many years. The codes were labeled by function: primary access override, secondary chamber bypass, emergency lockout reset. Each was accompanied by a timestamp indicating when they would expire, most within 24 hours of the upgrade completion, but a few marked for extended validity during the testing phase. What made Lenny's pulse quicken was not just what the codes could do, but what their existence revealed about the bank's security architecture. He had always assumed that the vault system operated on multiple independent authentication layers: biometric scanners, time-locked mechanisms, and encrypted keycards that would make unauthorized access virtually impossible. But this paper told a different story. It showed that the entire system had built-in backdoors, maintenance overrides that could bypass every other security measure when entered in the correct sequence. It was exactly the kind of failsafe that his engineering training told him would be necessary for system maintenance. But it was also exactly the kind of vulnerability that could bring down the entire security apparatus if exploited. Lenny folded the paper carefully and slipped it into his pocket, his mind already racing through possibilities he had never seriously considered before. He finished cleaning the conference room with mechanical precision, but his thoughts were 3 floors below, in the vault complex he had cleaned hundreds of times without ever imagining he might one day enter as something other than a janitor. Over the next 3 days, he carried the paper with him like a talisman, studying it during his breaks, memorizing the code sequences until he could recite them backwards. He researched the vault manufacturer online, using the public computers at the Newark Library to understand the technical specifications of the security system. What he learned both thrilled and terrified him. The temporary codes were designed to remain active for 72 hours after implementation, giving the technical team time to verify that all systems were functioning properly before the overrides were purged from the system. But the upgrade had been completed on March 15th. It was now March 18th. Depending on exactly when the codes had been generated, he might have anywhere from a few hours to a full day before they expired forever. The rational part of his mind, the part that had kept him employed and invisible for 14 years, told him to destroy the paper and forget he had ever seen it. But another part, the part that had been slowly dying since he had accepted that his engineering career was over, saw something else entirely. This was not just an opportunity for theft. This was a puzzle, a technical challenge of the sort he had not encountered since his days designing industrial control systems. Could the bank's security really be defeated by a combination of inside knowledge and forgotten maintenance codes? Could someone with his skills and access really walk out with millions of dollars? Or was the system more robust than it appeared? The engineering mindset that had once served him well in designing fail-safe systems now began working in reverse, identifying the points of failure in the very systems designed to prevent what he was contemplating. He began to see the bank not as his workplace, but as a complex machine with inputs, outputs, and control mechanisms that could be understood, predicted, and ultimately manipulated by someone with the right knowledge and the right access. By March 19th, Lenny had made his decision. He was going to test whether the bank's security was as vulnerable as the forgotten paper suggested. If it worked, he would have solved the ultimate engineering problem. If it didn't, he would simply continue his invisible existence, knowing that he had at least tried to reclaim some small piece of the intellectual challenge that had once defined his life. What he had not yet fully comprehended was that success would require him to become a different kind of ghost entirely, one who could vanish not just from sight, but from existence itself. Lenny Cruz had never stolen anything more valuable than a few office supplies, but he approached planning the heist with the same methodical precision that had once made him an excellent engineer. He understood that the difference between a failed robbery and a successful one lay not in dramatic action, but in careful preparation and thorough understanding of the systems involved. His first step was reconnaissance, but reconnaissance of a type that no security expert would have anticipated. Instead of casing the bank from outside, studying guard rotations, or looking for weaknesses in the perimeter, Lenny used his unique position to conduct what amounted to an insider's technical audit of the bank's security infrastructure. During his nightly cleaning rounds, he began paying attention to details that had previously been invisible to him. He noted the exact timing of the security camera sweeps, discovering that the system followed a predictable pattern designed to maximize coverage while minimizing storage requirements. Each camera recorded in high definition for 30-second intervals, then switched to motion detection mode for 90 seconds before returning to active recording. More importantly, he identified the camera's blind spots, not gaps in coverage, but brief moments during system cycling when a person could move through certain areas without being captured in high resolution. The bank's security designers had assumed that any unauthorized person in those areas would trigger motion sensors, but they had not accounted for someone whose authorized presence had trained the system to ignore their movement patterns. Lenny also studied the vault access procedures by observing the legitimate users during his cleaning shifts. He watched executives retrieve documents from safety deposit boxes, noted how they interacted with the access panels, and observed the timing sequences required for proper authentication. What became clear was that the system relied heavily on behavioral patterns. Authorized users moved through the access sequence with confidence and familiarity, while unauthorized users would hesitate or make mistakes that would trigger additional security measures. His engineering background allowed him to recognize that the temporary bypass codes would only work if entered with the same confidence and timing as a legitimate maintenance procedure. Any hesitation or incorrect sequence would likely trigger lockdown protocols that would end his attempt before it began. To practice the access sequence without raising suspicion, Lenny began testing the codes on other electronic systems throughout the bank. The same manufacturer had installed security panels on several conference rooms, and while these systems were far less sophisticated than the vault access, they used similar input methods and timing requirements. Late one night, while cleaning the third-floor conference area, he successfully used a modified version of the bypass sequence to override the electronic lock on conference room 3A. The lock disengaged with a soft click, and the access panel showed a brief maintenance mode message before returning to normal operation. More importantly, the incident did not appear in the next day's security logs, suggesting that maintenance-level overrides were not recorded in the same way as regular access attempts. This discovery was crucial. If the vault system operated on the same principle, his access attempt would leave minimal electronic traces that might not be discovered for days or even weeks. Lenny's next challenge was understanding the physical layout of the vault complex. His cleaning duties gave him access to the outer areas in the main corridor, but he had never been inside the actual vault chambers where the cash was stored. However, his maintenance access card allowed him to enter the adjacent utility areas where the building's mechanical systems served the vault level. From studying the HVAC schematics posted in the utility room, he was able to map the vault's internal layout. The primary chamber held safety deposit boxes and document storage, while the secondary chamber, accessible through a separate access point, contained the cash reserves. The secondary chamber was where he would need to go, and it required a second authentication step that was normally handled by a two-person verification system. But the temporary bypass codes included overrides for both chambers, eliminating the need for dual authentication during maintenance procedures. As his understanding of the bank's security architecture deepened, Lenny realized that his success would depend not just on technical knowledge, but on psychological preparation. He would need to move through the vault complex with the same invisible confidence that had served him for 14 years, despite the fact that he would be committing the largest theft in the bank's history. To prepare for this mental challenge, he began visualizing the entire sequence during his regular cleaning duties, walking through each step in his mind while performing routine tasks. He practiced maintaining his normal breathing and heart rate while imagining the stress of the actual attempt. He even tested his ability to remain calm under pressure by deliberately triggering minor access violations, entering his card incorrectly, or approaching security panels from unusual angles, and observing his body's physiological responses. By early April, Lenny had developed what amounted to a complete operational plan. He knew exactly when and how to access the vault, which specific bills to target for maximum value and minimum detection time, and how to remove the money from the building without triggering the automated counting systems that monitored large cash movements. What he still needed was an exit strategy that would allow him to disappear not just from the bank, but from his entire previous life. Because Leonard Cruz, the janitor, would cease to exist the moment Leonard Cruz, the bank thief, walked out of First National Trust with $10.2 million in stolen cash. Creating a new identity would have been impossible for most people, but Lenny's years of invisible existence had inadvertently prepared him for vanishing completely. He had no close family, few friends, and a lifestyle so routine that his absence might not be noticed for weeks. What he needed was not just to disappear, but to do so in a way that would leave investigators with no trail to follow. His first step was establishing what he thought of as the ghost infrastructure, the resources and preparations necessary to support his new, non-existent life. This process began 6 months before he found the vault codes, during a period when he had been considering early retirement and wondering what life might look like outside the familiar routine of night shift cleaning. Lenny had always been frugal by necessity. His janitor's salary barely covered his modest expenses, but his lack of social life and expensive hobbies had allowed him to accumulate a small savings account over the years. More importantly, he had maintained the habits of careful financial planning that dated back to his engineering days, when he had earned enough to think about investments and retirement planning. He began converting his savings to cash in small increments, withdrawing amounts just below the reporting thresholds that would trigger bank notifications. Over the course of 5 months, he had accumulated nearly $8,000 in cash, not enough to fund a comfortable retirement, but sufficient to support the logistical requirements of disappearing. The first major purchase was a used travel trailer, bought from a private seller in Pennsylvania, who accepted cash and seemed uninterested in paperwork. The trailer was old enough to have minimal electronic systems, but well-maintained and equipped for extended off-grid living. Lenny registered it under a variation of his name, Leonard C. Cruz, instead of Leonard F. Cruz, a small discrepancy that would be easy to overlook but might complicate computerized searches. He stored the trailer at a commercial lot outside Trenton, paying 6 months in advance and choosing a facility that relied on simple padlock security rather than electronic access systems. To anyone who asked, he was planning extended camping trips after retirement. The next component was transportation. Lenny's daily driver was a 12-year-old Honda Civic that was reliable but completely unremarkable, exactly the kind of vehicle that traffic cameras and witnesses would fail to notice. But for his post-heist travel, he needed something more capable and equally anonymous. He found it at a bankruptcy auction in upstate New York, a used panel van that had belonged to a painting contractor. The van was sturdy, had high mileage but good maintenance records, and most importantly, looked like the kind of commercial vehicle that could be parked almost anywhere without attracting attention. Lenny bought the van for cash, registered it through a mail forwarding service in Albany, and stored it at a different commercial lot 40 miles from where he kept the trailer. His plan was to use his regular car for the actual heist, then switch to the van for the initial escape phase, and finally switch to the trailer for long-term travel. Each vehicle represented a different phase of his disappearance, and none of them could be easily connected to Leonard Cruz, the bank janitor. The most crucial element of his exit strategy was documentation. While he couldn't create a completely new identity without sophisticated resources he didn't have access to, he could muddy the waters enough to buy time and confuse investigators. Lenny had discovered that the Social Security Administration's databases contained numerous small errors and duplications, especially for people with common names who had lived in multiple states. By carefully researching public records, he found 3 other Leonard Cruzes born within 2 years of his birth date, 2 of whom had died in other states decades earlier. Using information from obituaries and public records, he began building a paper trail that suggested Leonard F. Cruz of Newark had moved to Oregon in 2019, taken a job with a landscaping company that had since gone out of business, and most recently had been living as a transient worker with no fixed address. This false history required months of careful preparation. He had mail forwarded to a series of addresses, created accounts with libraries and services in Oregon using those addresses, and even filed tax returns showing minimal income from seasonal work. To investigators conducting a superficial search, it would appear that Leonard Cruz had gradually transitioned from his janitorial job to a nomadic lifestyle that would make him difficult to locate. The beauty of this approach was that it didn't require him to maintain a false identity indefinitely. He only needed to confuse the trail long enough to establish himself in a new location with sufficient resources to begin again. By the time Lenny found the vault access codes, his exit strategy was nearly complete. He had 3 vehicles positioned at strategic locations, enough cash to support himself for months, documentation that would muddy any initial investigation, and a detailed plan for traveling from New Jersey to Canada while staying off major highways and avoiding areas with extensive surveillance networks. What he didn't have yet was a clear sense of what his life would look like after the theft. But as he studied those temporary bypass codes, he realized that this question had become less important than the technical challenge of whether he could actually pull off what he was contemplating. The engineer in him was fascinated by the puzzle of defeating a multi-million-dollar security system. The janitor in him was tired of being invisible by necessity rather than choice. And the man who had lost everything once before was ready to risk everything on the possibility that he might be able to disappear on his own terms, with enough money to never be invisible again. Friday, April 28th began like any other workday for the staff of First National Trust. But for Lenny Cruz, it represented the culmination of months of preparation and the beginning of the most technically challenging night of his life. He had chosen Friday specifically because weekend processing delays would give him additional hours before the theft was discovered, and because the Friday night security rotation included guards who were familiar enough with his presence to pay him no special attention. Lenny arrived for his shift at 11:03 p.m., 3 minutes later than his usual punctual arrival time. This minor deviation was calculated. Security systems that monitored for behavioral anomalies were designed to flag dramatic changes in routine, but small variations fell within normal parameters. He badged in through the service entrance exactly as he had thousands of times before, nodding to the night security guard Rodriguez, who was reading a paperback novel and barely glanced up from his desk. "Evening, Lenny," Rodriguez said, as he always did. "Evening," Lenny replied, his voice steady despite the adrenaline beginning to build in his system. He collected his cleaning cart from the service closet and began his usual rounds on the upper floors. To anyone monitoring his movements through the security cameras, this was Leonard Cruz performing the same routine he had perfected over 14 years. But tonight, several crucial elements were different. Hidden within his standard cleaning supplies was a small toolkit he had assembled from items that would appear innocuous during a routine search. A tube of industrial adhesive that could be used to temporarily disable camera mechanisms. Several black cable ties that could serve multiple purposes. A small spray bottle filled with a solution that would leave surfaces clean but slightly reflective, potentially causing glare issues for camera systems. More importantly, he had modified his cleaning cart to include a specialized storage compartment concealed within the standard waste container. The compartment was lined with the kind of anti-static material used for electronic components, and was large enough to hold the equivalent of several $1 million in bundled currency while maintaining the cart's normal external appearance and weight distribution. Lenny worked through the upper floors with mechanical precision, his body performing familiar tasks while his mind rehearsed the sequence of events that would begin in approximately 3 hours. He emptied waste baskets, wiped down surfaces, and vacuumed carpets, all while conducting a final mental review of the vault access procedures. At 1:47 a.m., he completed his normal cleaning routine and submitted his standard completion report through the electronic system. According to this report, his shift was finished, and he would normally badge out and leave the building within the next 20 minutes. Instead, he initiated the special maintenance request he had prepared weeks earlier. The request indicated that a cleaning issue in the basement level required extended attention, specifically a problem with the industrial waste chute that collected refuse from the upper floors. This type of mechanical issue was not uncommon, and the request authorized him to remain in the building for up to 3 additional hours to complete the necessary work. What made this request particularly clever was that it explained his presence in the basement level without requiring additional authorization, and the nature of the work meant that he would be moving equipment and materials that could account for any unusual activity detected by the security systems. At 2:15 a.m., Lenny took the service elevator to the basement level, wheeling his modified cart through corridors that were completely empty at this hour. The overnight security staff rarely ventured below the main banking floor unless specifically called, and the automated systems that monitored this area were calibrated to ignore his presence. The vault-level corridors stretched ahead of him, lit by harsh fluorescent lights that created deep shadows between the industrial fixtures. Lenny had walked this corridor thousands of times, but tonight each step carried him closer to crossing a line from which there could be no return. At 2:31 a.m., he reached the access point for Vault C7's secondary chamber. The control panel was exactly as he had studied and memorized. A standard commercial security interface with a numeric keypad, card reader, and biometric scanner. Under normal circumstances, accessing this vault would require a valid access card, a personal identification code, and a fingerprint scan from an authorized user. But tonight was not normal circumstances. Lenny removed the crumpled paper from his pocket and unfolded it carefully under the corridor lights. The temporary bypass codes were still clearly legible, though he had memorized them so thoroughly that he could have entered them with his eyes closed. He inserted his maintenance access card into the reader, waited for the green light that indicated system recognition, then began entering the first bypass sequence. His fingers moved across the keypad with the steady confidence of someone performing routine maintenance, exactly as he had practiced dozens of times on the conference room security panels. The system responded exactly as the engineering documentation had promised. Instead of requesting biometric authentication, the control panel displayed "Maintenance Mode Activated" and prompted him for the secondary bypass code. Lenny entered the second sequence, his heart rate remaining steady despite the magnitude of what he was attempting. Years of invisible work had taught him to maintain calm professionalism, even in stressful situations, and that training served him well as he committed the largest bank theft in the city's history. The massive vault door began its opening sequence with a series of mechanical clicks and electronic confirmation tones. Within 30 seconds, Lenny was looking into a chamber that held more money than he had ever imagined seeing in one place. The cash was organized in neat stacks on metal shelving, bundled according to denomination and secured with paper bands that indicated the count and verification dates. The hundreds were stored on the middle shelves for easy access during normal operations, exactly where Lenny had expected to find them, based on his study of the bank's cash management procedures. Working with practiced efficiency, he began transferring bundles of hundreds into the concealed compartment of his cleaning cart. Each bundle contained $10,000, and he took exactly 102 bundles, leaving behind enough cash to ensure that a casual visual inspection would not immediately reveal the theft. The entire process took 11 minutes. By 2:42 a.m., Lenny had loaded $10.2 million into his cleaning cart and was beginning the process of securing the vault and eliminating any traces of his presence. He wiped down all surfaces he had touched, ensured that the remaining cash was arranged to minimize visual evidence of the theft, and used the bypass codes to return the vault system to normal operation. The massive door closed with the same series of mechanical sounds, and the control panel returned to its standard security status. At 2:54 a.m., Leonard Cruz wheeled his cleaning cart back through the basement corridor, past the service elevator, and toward the loading dock where his real disappearance would begin. The janitor who had entered the vault no longer existed. In his place was a man carrying more money than most people would see in several lifetimes, and walking toward a future that he had spent months preparing for, but could not fully imagine. The service loading dock of First National Trust opened onto Merchant Street, a narrow corridor between commercial buildings that saw minimal traffic during the overnight hours. Lenny had chosen this exit point specifically because the loading area was not covered by the bank's external security cameras, which focused on customer entrances and the main street frontage. At 3:02 a.m., he pushed his cleaning cart through the loading dock door and into the cold April air. The street was empty except for his 12-year-old Honda Civic, parked in the same spot where he had left it every workday for the past 3 years. To any observer, this was simply Leonard Cruz ending another routine shift and heading home to his apartment in Newark. But routine ended the moment he opened his car trunk. Working with mechanical precision, Lenny transferred the bundled currency from his cleaning cart to a series of heavy-duty garbage bags he had positioned in the trunk earlier that evening. The money filled 4 bags, each weighing approximately 60 pounds, and containing $2.55 million in hundreds. He arranged the bags to distribute the weight evenly and prevent shifting during transport. He then returned his cleaning cart to the loading dock, positioning it exactly where he would normally leave it for the next shift's cleaning crew. This detail was crucial. Any deviation from his standard routine might trigger questions when investigators began reconstructing his final night at the bank. At 3:18 a.m., Lenny drove away from First National Trust for the last time. His route took him through the empty streets of downtown Newark, past the apartment building where Leonard Cruz the janitor had lived for 8 years, and onto the network of secondary roads he had memorized during months of preparation. His first stop was a 24-hour storage facility on Route 22, where he had rented a unit under the name L.C. Cruz 6 months earlier. The facility's security consisted of basic keypad access and a single surveillance camera at the main gate, but no internal monitoring of individual units. Lenny transferred the money from his car to the storage unit, where additional supplies were waiting: a change of clothing, hair dye, scissors, and most importantly, the keys to his second vehicle. He spent 23 minutes in the storage unit, transforming his appearance from a familiar bank janitor to an unremarkable middle-aged man who could blend into any crowd. When he emerged, Leonard F. Cruz had effectively ceased to exist. His bank uniform was sealed in a garbage bag that would be incinerated along with other evidence. His employee identification, access cards, and anything else that connected him to First National Trust was similarly disposed of. At 4:41 a.m., he was driving a different vehicle, the panel van he had purchased months earlier, toward the second stage of his disappearance. The van's Pennsylvania registration and commercial appearance made it virtually invisible on highways designed for freight transport. His route to the Canadian border avoided major interstate highways in favor of smaller routes through rural Pennsylvania and upstate New York. This path was longer and slower than direct highways, but it took him through areas with minimal surveillance infrastructure and few opportunities for random police encounters. Every element of the journey had been planned to minimize electronic traces. He paid for gas with cash at stations that still accepted payment without requiring identification. He avoided toll roads that used automated license plate readers. When he stopped for food or rest, he chose locations without extensive security camera systems. The most critical stop was a rest area near Binghamton, New York, where he had hidden his travel trailer months earlier. The trailer represented the final phase of his disappearance, a mobile base that would allow him to travel throughout Canada and the northern United States while maintaining a low-profile and flexible schedule. Connecting the trailer to his van took less than 15 minutes, but it marked a psychological transition as significant as the vault theft itself. Leonard Cruz, the bank employee, was gone. Leonard Cruz, the criminal, was about to disappear as well. What remained was a man with sufficient resources to create an entirely new identity and lifestyle, but who would need to remain vigilant forever about maintaining his anonymity. By sunrise on Saturday morning, Lenny was crossing into Canada through a rural border crossing that processed primarily agricultural and recreational traffic. His trailer and Pennsylvania plates drew no special attention from customs officials who processed dozens of similar vehicles each day during fishing season. He presented identification that established him as Leonard C. Cruz, a recently retired maintenance worker planning to spend the summer traveling through Canadian provincial parks. The documentation was not false. He had legally established this slightly variant identity months earlier, but it would make computerized searches more difficult for investigators who were looking for Leonard F. Cruz, the missing bank janitor. 3 days later, Leonard Cruz's abandoned Honda Civic was discovered in the parking lot of Newark Liberty International Airport, creating the impression that he had fled the country by air. By then, he was nearly 1,000 miles away, established in a campground on the shores of Lake Superior, living in a travel trailer, purchased with legitimate savings and carrying identification that had no obvious connection to First National Trust. The man who had stolen $10.2 million was learning to live as someone who had simply chosen to disappear from a life that had never offered him much reason to stay visible. But as he would soon discover, vanishing completely was only the first challenge of his new existence. The much greater challenge would be learning to live with the knowledge of what he had done, and the constant awareness that his freedom depended on never making a single mistake that could connect him to the crime that had made him wealthy beyond his wildest dreams.